Hello, class. How are you doing? This week, I want to talk about Ovid's Metamorphosis. And in order to do that, I have to kind of pull back and give you a little bit of historical context about what's going on with regard to Ovid when he was writing. And why are we reading Greek myths by Romans? So Ovid was a Roman, and I will talk a lot more about Ovid in the next video, but I wanted to give you some context about what was happening at the time he was alive, why there's this big change with the Greek names of the gods, which turned and were transformed, right, into the Roman gods' names. So I want to take us back a little bit and talk a little bit about the different eras of Greek myth and literature. So in order to kind of give some context about all of the different things that are happening, a lot of times we've talked about, or we've read about um, the historical changes with regard to the Greek literature, the Greek myths, and they have their own. The mythos has its own set of time, which starts obviously at the creation and then goes into the Titans and the Olympians. But this is ancient Greece, the history of ancient Greece, and three eras really signify the literature of ancient Greece. We've been reading primarily ancient Greek texts that are from mostly the classical period. But there are three different eras that signify some of the readings that we've been reading. The Archaic, the Classical or Hellenic, and the Hellenistic periods. Now, Classical or Hellenic period shouldn't be confused with Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period shows a diverging of Greek culture into Roman culture because the Romans were conquering Greece. And classical Hellenic culture is particularly Greek. So we're reading from both of those. And Ovid's life really kind of intersects during the end of the Hellenic period and into the Hellenistic period, because Ovid was a Roman poet and he was very political, and he was living during a time where these myths were already becoming ancient. So it's a predicament and it can get a little confusing, but that's why we're talking about this today. So the Archaic period comes after and is preceded by the Dark Ages, where we don't know a lot about this time. So there's a lot of question about what was going on politically, what was going on religiously, culturally. There isn't a lot of information that we get from this period. However, the Archaic period shows some economic boost, and the Greeks that were living during this time became much more solidified in ideas of the very beginning ideas of democracy, and the writing, the philosophers are very individualized, and we do read some of the Archaic and have read some of the Archaic writings. This is a time when the myths were really a specific part and an integral part of the religious system that was happening and the culture. So we do get a lot of folklore. We get a lot of stories from a number of different authors that are kind of talking about some of the same things with regard to myth, and especially myth when we're talking about the gods. Most of what we read in this class is based in the classical era. And the classical era is just this very rich time for ancient Greece. We have both philosophers as well as other types of writers, along with many different artists who typify this era. And this is pretty important for getting the ideas about Greek culture, really talking about the ideas of Greek culture being truly Greek. Even though during this time there was a lot of turmoil, as I've spoken about in other lectures, we know that there were many different areas that were fighting for control over this geographical area. But we do have the tenets of philosophy with Socrates and Plato, and later Aristotle, who is also part of the Hellenistic period. But we're reading the Odyssey in this class, Homer, the Iliad, which takes from a lot of different older myths from the archaic period and previously, and the oral tradition, but is really being read widely during this time. So the classical era, the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, 480 to 323 around, so is centered on individual tragedies. The writers are Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, many different writers. I put a very famous picture of Sappho, who was also writing during this time, and we will be reading some of Sappho's work. The classical era is a time of enlightenment for these people. It's a time of an incredible array of different arts forms, music, literature, visual art. The changes between the artwork that's being done is pretty substantial. In the previous slide, I showed this picture of the Charos and the Chari, which are very typical sculptures, and you'll see a lot of these sculptures during the archaic time, the time of the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, who preceded them. But they're very rigid, they're very upright, balanced, and perfect. Definitely different from what was happening in Egypt, but we see a lot of profile, but definitely different. This changes even with the art of the classical era. We see reliefs, sculptures of humans that are in repose, that are standing on one leg, or putting their weight on one leg. They aren't upright and inflexible. So even in the artwork, a lot of stuff is just happening. This is an explosion of literature that we still talk about today, obviously. It's a pretty important time period. So the classical era, then everything changes. This goes from about 323 BCE to, it says 31 here, but it varies in different eras. By different historians, but definitely the Hellenistic period, which is different from the classical period, sees a lot of Greek poetry, prose, culture. It's expanding across the Mediterranean. Their influence is huge, and they start to influence the Romans, and the Romans begin to invade and eventually conquer Greece. And most of what they do is change the gods of ancient Greece. The ideas from ancient Greece, the democracy from ancient Greece, and they begin to replicate it, being heavily influenced by it in Rome. So unfortunately, with only a few exceptions, much of what was created during the Archaic and Classical period remains only in fragments. A lot of stuff is lost to time. We're going to see this happen because we're going to see it in the actual literature. When you read the story of Apollo and Daphne, which I'll talk about in the next video, you're going to read about, and we're going to talk about how the old gods that become the new gods really kind of shape and reshape what we think of as Greek mythology and Greece itself. And the story of Apollo and Daphne is a really good example of that, because Apollo becomes the embodiment of what is an ancient site of Delphi or Delphi. And so we are going to see that come into play with the changing of the cultures. We see it again in Hellenistic Greece when we start to see these changes in the names. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a really handy website that goes over the names of the ancient Greeks gods and then the names of the Roman gods that were renamed. So we see obviously a change in Zeus to Jove or Jupiter, and we see all of the pantheon of the Olympic gods being changed over in name. A lot of other stuff was happening in terms of that, and we will get to it in the next video. But I wanted to give you just a generalized kind of historical take on what was happening in these three different periods, what you guys are reading about, and that for right now, we're moving into Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a later work. And whereas we will read the Odyssey in a little while, and the Odyssey is an earlier work, but they definitely span a time, and that time is the difference between being occupied and colonized by the Romans versus the Greeks having a specific culture, even if it's a culture of disparate and kind of many different smaller factions, like Sparta, for example, and Athens and the Athenians. They're very disparate and very different, but they are in this one geographical area. And this really does change after being conquered by Rome. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. We're going to talk a little bit about Ovid, his relation to the Roman political system, his relationship with Virgil, and his influences, his early influences. And then we're going to talk about the transformations. But I think that that's the big theme, primarily for this reading, is the theme of transformation, metamorphosis, and on top of that, what do we do when everything has shifted, and what are common people doing, what are aristocrats doing with regard to being under a new regime. And that's what I have for you. So we'll talk in the next video.